and welcome to Blacklist. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Michael Schulman, whose new book is Oscar Wars, with a delicious subtitle, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Nancy. It's great to meet you.
You as well. I just thought your book was so interesting, and I have to say, I stopped at most chapters many times so I could look up the relevant references on YouTube, which I want to talk about a few that I saw, just to see what you think too. So Michael, how did this book come about? I know your earlier book was about Meryl Streep, so clearly you're a movie person, but where did this particular book come about?
Well, the germ of it was a piece I wrote for The New Yorker, where I'm a staff writer, in 2017. This was the year following Oscars So White, and the Academy was trying to diversify its membership, which was just causing so much sturm and drang in Hollywood. And I was interested in writing about how the Academy president, Cheryl Boone Isaacs, was weathering this storm. So I went out to Hollywood. I spent some time with her. I went to Academy headquarters and learned a lot about the history of the Academy. And then I went to the awards for the first time to cover them in person for the magazine. And I was in the press room that year. And it just so happened, if you remember, that this was the year of the big envelope mix-up with Moonlight and La La Land. And I just remember when they finally showed the card that said Moonlight, everybody in this press room just screamed like something was actually happening. And I just saw, having observed and thought a lot about how this year had played out, I saw it as this kind of epic tale of, Hollywood having this sort of racial reckoning. And then it all exploded with this insane sort of twist ending, like a Hollywood twist ending. And I saw that as like a big story. And that's really where the germ came for the book. A lot of Oscar books exist that are kind of catalogs of every year, who won, who lost, what records were set, who hosted. And my idea for the book was to just do about 12 chapters and each chapter would go really deep on a particular year or a conflict or even a single category and kind of immerse the reader in what happened that year and who the characters were and how each of those moments reflected some change in American culture or in the evolution of Hollywood.
Well, you start with the formation of the Academy itself, and it's really a question about whether it was even needed and why it continued. So what was it about that beginning that made you interested in that? Like, what did you see was the turning point for the Academy as it marched up toward 2017 and beyond?
Well, I mean, what's so interesting about the founding of the Academy, I knew I'd have to start with year one, basically. And there was so much going on. I mean, we think of, 2017 was such a year of flux and change. But as soon as you look at any, a year like 1927 through 1929, which is when they finally had the first Academy Awards, that was years of incredible upheaval in Hollywood. You had the arrival of the talkies, the first Academy Awards in 29. All of the nominated movies were silent films. And they had the Jazz Singer, the groundbreaking talkie that changed the entire medium. They gave it an honorary award because it couldn't even be in competition with the other movies. It was a completely different thing. And then by the next year, the second Academy Awards, all of the movies had sound. So right away, you're starting with chaos and upheaval and uncertainty. And that really captured my interest because already you have a story of these people like Louis B. Mayer and Mary Pickford, all the most powerful people in Hollywood, dealing with a seismic change right from moment one.
Yeah. And how did you end up then following that, which was a natural beginning, the start of the Academy, the founding of the Academy? How did you pick the particular particular years, not so much episodes, the particular years that you honed in on? And were there some other time periods that you wish that you could have included, but that would have made the book too big?
Yeah, well, that was really the fun part, is going through all 9.5 decades of Oscar history and choosing the really, really juicy years. And I basically had 3 criteria. The first was I wanted them to be spread out, essentially at least one chapter set per decade, starting in the 20s. A lot of crazy stuff happened in the 70s, and I could have just done an entire book on the Oscars in the 70s. You had Sasheen Littlefeather, The Streaker, a million different crazy things were happening. The second criteria was I wanted to have years that still had movies or people that still resonate with us today. I didn't want them to be too obscure. And then the third and most important one was that I wanted to choose stories that would be more than the sum of their parts. In other words, like something that gave you a window onto how the times were changing, or that had a really compelling personal story attached, or just like a year where just the combination of characters was explosive in some way. So for instance, I have a chapter on the Best Picture race of 1976, which was an incredible lineup. So tell me which one does not belong here. You have One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Barry Lyndon, Dog Day Afternoon, Nashville, and Jaws. It's like one of these things is not like the other. And so you have sort of 4 auteurist, anti-authoritarian, new Hollywood masterpieces, and then the first huge summer blockbuster by a 20-something kid named Spielberg, and which recreated the business model for Hollywood and sort of was the death knell for that other kind of movie, that sort of, rebellious 70s kind of movie. I think Jaws is a great movie, but it helped shift the tide in Hollywood toward the sort of more commercialism and big money of the 80s. So just honing in on those 5 movies, how they got made, what the Oscar race was like, how do they all collide? On Oscar night, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest famously won every single major award. It's one of only 3 movies to do that. And yet, Jaws was kind of the winner in some larger sense because it remade the industry. So that, for instance, is a story that I thought was, of all the crazy stories in the 70s from the Oscars, that was one that told you something about the era.
I was just, one of the things I remember about that chapter especially was about Steven Spielberg, who of course, plays an important role in the book because he was such an important person in Hollywood, that his mother called him Cecil B. de Spielberg, which I thought was just, I still chuckle when I think about that. So was there another event that you couldn't include from those 70s, from that 76?
Actually, yes. There was one chapter that I cut from the book, which was I did a whole chapter on the streaker, the guy who ran across the stage in 1974. And this guy lived an amazing life. His name was Robert Opel. And after he did the streak, he was very involved in the gay liberation movement. He moved to San Francisco and opened an erotic art gallery, and he exhibited people like Robert Mapplethorpe, and he knew like John Waters and Divine. And then in 1979, 5 years after the streak, he was murdered in this, in this horrible event where 2 guys came in with guns to his gallery, and there was a whole, true crime aspect to this story. And I wrote the whole thing. And when I put it all together, my editor and I thought, this story doesn't even have anything to do with Hollywood. It's incredible, but it doesn't tell this larger tale of how the movies evolved. So what I did in the end was take it out of the book, and it was just published in the New Yorker as a kind of standalone magazine piece. So I'm happy it found a home, but that's an example of, that's really the one big thing that I wrote and then took out of the book.
I imagine you must have spent a lot of time rewatching old Bette Davis movies. What was, I mean, I found her fascinating. I think of all the people, she was so interesting. How did you feel? I mean, did you come to have personal feelings for some of these people?
Well, you'll notice that a lot of characters every chapter has a new cast of characters, but Bette Davis just kept coming back and coming back. I mean, she's just a great person to write about because she's always just on fire. She's always saying some dramatic line. You know, her autobiography, The Lonely Life, is just one of my favorite Hollywood memoirs. You know, it has that voice. You know, the first line of it is something like, you know, I have always been driven by some distant music, a battle hymn, no doubt. You know, she just comes out. She's always fighting with someone. But here, I want to show you something. Behind me, this is a picture of my grandmother, Doris, with Bette Davis.
Oh, my God. Wow. How did that happen?
So the story that I heard was that my grandmother, who was a great beauty, this is her, she was involved in a Jewish organization called ORT, which still exists. And she was, I don't know, Bette Davis was doing a stage show and she had given them tickets or they had done something with her. And so my grandmother's presenting her with flowers as a thank you. And I just love the stage makeup, you know, her eyes, the famous Bette Davis eyes. So this is sort of my little personal connection.
Right. What about, so with all of this Hollywood, all of this Oscar stuff in your mind and, you know, even after the book is done, and then Sacheen Littlefeather dies recently, you know, I felt like that was so interesting because I had just finished the book and was thinking about that. So even though we think it's past, these people still have an impact on us.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things about Hollywood history, like all history, is that it never really dies. You know, it keeps coming back. And this whole thing with Sacheen Littlefeather this past year was just incredible. You know, first of all, her speech at the Academy Awards in '73, I think, when she declined Marlon Brando's Oscar for The Godfather, that was one of the strangest things and most unpredictable things that has ever happened in the Oscars. And so, you know, half century later, the Academy formally apologized to her for how she was booed and how she was treated in the press. And they do a whole event for her at the Academy Museum to sort of, you know, like bring her in officially into sort of Academy history. It was a lovely event. I watched it on YouTube. And then I think they must have known that she was very seriously ill. She had cancer for several years before that, because then she died right after that. And then, like, the next week, her sisters come out and say that she had been lying about her heritage, and that caused a whole commotion online. I mean, it was so, it was really hard to wrap your mind around.
Right. And a couple other events that you write about, that you go into depth about. One is Alan Carr's, when he produced the Oscars. Could you describe that for us? Because I have to say, I went back and looked at it. I looked at the opening number with Snow White and Rob Lowe on YouTube, and just thought, well, if they had done it this year, nobody would have said anything. It would have just fit into
Right.
So talk about that.
Yeah, so this was a really fun chapter to write, probably my favorite, because it's so full of 1980s excess. So this was 1989. The producer Alan Carr, who is sort of best remembered for producing Grease, that was his claim to fame. But he did several things. He was also known for wearing fabulous caftans and throwing amazing parties. So he produced the Oscars. He had been waiting his whole life to produce the Oscars. Finally got a chance, and he put on this gigantic 11-minute opening number with a woman dressed as Snow White, sort of talking to people in the audience. And then Rob Lowe comes on, and they're at the Coconut Grove, and like the tables start dancing. I mean, it's hallucinatory. So this year has this reputation as the worst Oscars ever. And every year or so, there's some article that says, oh, remember this tacky Oscars. It basically ruined Alan Carr's life. You know, he was banned from the industry after this. But when I went back and looked at it, it was a much more interesting story than that. It was actually kind of tragic, you know. This was someone who had revered the Oscars and revered old Hollywood for his entire life and finally had his dream come true. But he was like Icarus flying too close to the sun. And, you know, part of the reason why it's remembered in that way was this snowball effect, where because the show got terrible reviews, that set off Disney, which sued the Academy for, you know, copyright infringement. And because of that whole thing getting terrible press from the Academy, all of these elders of the Academy, like Gregory Peck and Blake Edwards, all came together and wrote this letter, this open letter about what a horrible embarrassment the show had been. So when you go back and look at it, like, you know, all of the opening numbers in the 80s are pretty much that schlocky. But this one just had this chain reaction that sort of cemented it in in pop culture memory as like a complete fiasco. And it's so interesting to go back and like reconstruct, why did we remember certain things in a certain way? And who were the people behind it whose lives were, you know, dramatically affected by that?
Right. Yeah. And because the woman who was a virtual unknown, really, who played Snow White, left Hollywood. I mean, right? She just couldn't take it.
I talked to her. Her name's Eileen Bowman. I talked to her. She told me the whole story of this crazy story of her day-long audition where they drove her around. They drove her to Alan Carr's house, and the pool was pink, and like she didn't know what was going on. She thought she was auditioning for a Las Vegas review, and then they tell her she's going to be Snow White at the Oscars. Like she just was completely, as she put it to me, she was like a church girl from San Diego, and she said she had just fallen off the turnip truck and had no idea what was going on, and suddenly she's at the center of this, you know, kind of scandalous Oscar opening number.
And then there's, you know, still to come in Rob Lowe's life is the sex tape that he made. And so that brought back the Oscar, the whole Oscar fiasco. Yeah, I guess the two people I felt sorriest for in that chapter were Eileen Bowman and Alan Carr. I would urge people to go back and look at that because it is so tame, really, compared to what we see now. That's one of those things that makes you realize that some things really are way ahead of their time, and if you could have just time traveled and moved it, you know, Eileen Bowman would have been a star today. I'm convinced of it.
Well, and also to give Alan Carr some credit, he invented some things that remained. You know, he changed the line from "and the winner is" to "and the Oscar goes to," and that is still what they say. You know, he was very big on the fashion. You know, we didn't have a big red carpet thing then, and he sort of pushed the fashion, and that of course evolved into, you know, Joan Rivers, you know, doing her thing for E, and now it's like it's basically its own show. So, you know, I kind of wanted to redeem a little bit of Alan Carr, but it's also, to me, a sort of human tragedy of a guy who just kept getting in his own way, kept trying to put his name on everything. And so when it didn't go well, there was someone to blame. You know, it's really a story about ostracism and blaming.
Yeah, yeah. And that kind of brings up a more serious issue that you deal with in depth. It was the Hollywood 10, the Hollywood and the House Un-American Activities Committee, or Hollywood and the communist threat. And I know there have been many books about that as well, but I felt that there were things in that chapter that I thought I hadn't read before. I mean, I sort of think you brought Dalton Trumbo to life in a way that I hadn't known him as. But could you talk about that whole period?
Sure. Well, I mean, I always knew I had to deal in the book with the Hollywood blacklist, but it's a huge topic. It's a horrible, dark chapter in Hollywood history. And as you say, a lot has been written about it. But I found this story within that had to do with the Oscars that I just loved, which was in 1957, Deborah Carr came out to present Best Motion Picture Story, which is a category that no longer exists. And it went to a guy named Robert Rich. Robert Rich wasn't there. Someone else picked up the award for him for this movie called The Brave One, which is about a Mexican boy and his pet donkey or pet bull. And people soon realized that this Robert Rich guy did not exist. Like, they asked the producers. The producers said, he was an XGI we met in Munich several years ago. We've lost track of him. Maybe he's in Europe somewhere. Maybe he's in Australia. As Life magazine put it, it was a Hollywood whodunit. And it was this bizarre scandal that kind of titillated people back in 1957. Of course, as it turned out, it was a pseudonym for Dalton Trumbo, who was blacklisted and working on the black market. So what he did was, as soon as he realized that this thing was becoming a press sensation, that his sort of fake persona had won an Oscar, he realized that even though he was relatively powerless, he could leverage this press attention against the industry and against the Academy and make them look ridiculous. And just, tracing his sort of caper of sitting in his office in Hollywood, like behind his typewriter, or sometimes he would type it from the bathtub, trying just with his wit and cleverness to turn the tables and outwit the people who had, ruined his career because he was one of the Hollywood 10. It was weirdly funny. Like, it was sort of a fun, exciting, suspenseful way to tell the story of the blacklist that I hadn't seen. It's obviously a very sad subject, but focusing on sort of Dalton Trumbo, who's a very clever, funny person, just using his wiles. And he would send in little poems he sent a little poem into Life magazine when they asked if he was Robert Rich. And it went, "Come back, Robert Rich, wherever you are. Do you live on the moon? Do you live on a star?" He would just make a big joke out of it as a way to embarrass this oppressive system. And I just found it totally fascinating and like a sort of fun way to tell this story.
I don't think that I certainly didn't remember the name Cheryl Boone Isaacs, who was the president of the Academy. But in earlier years, the presidents often came out of the acting community, right? Like Gregory Peck and Mary Pickford was an early president. Why do you think those early years where those heads of the Academy were much better known sort of changed, if you think it did?
Yeah, well, actually, the first president was her husband, Douglas.
Douglas Fairbanks, right?
But I think that when they started the Academy, the producers like Louis B. Mayer, they didn't want it to seem like they were using the Academy to sort of control labor relations, which they were. So they kind of had Fairbanks step up as a figurehead. And, he was this beloved star and swashbuckler, from the Three Musketeers or whatever. And I don't know, over the years, I think the most famous Academy presidents have been actors. I would say Gregory Peck, but also, Frank Capra was a transformative president. Betty Davis had a short and tumultuous tenure, which is covered in the 1941-42 chapter. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of presidents that we forget because they're less known to us now. But certainly, Cheryl Boone Isaacs was a longtime publicist and sort of Oscar strategist by the time she got that job in 2013. I don't know. I think maybe we remember the famous ones, but I mean, so many people have been Academy presidents over the years. It kind of changes around with the different branches.
Right. So, are there some other Oscar books that you recommend or other Hollywood books that you recommend?
Absolutely.
Or that you loved? Yeah, good.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Some of my favorite authors to read on Hollywood are Mark Harris, who wrote a wonderful book about the Academy Awards called Pictures at a Revolution, which just traces the 5 movies that were nominated for Best Picture in 1968. It's a really great book, I took a lot of inspiration from that because he really sees the Oscars as a prism to understand culture. Although because he had written this great book, I had to skip that year in mine. It had been covered. I love the author Sam Wasson, who just released this gigantic tome called Hollywood, the Oral History, which he did with Janine Basinger. And one of my favorite books of his is called Fifth Avenue 5 a.m., which is about the making of Breakfast at Tiffany. He's just such a charming writer. And then Peter Biskind, who is famous for Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. He also wrote a really great book about the 90s indie era called, oh my gosh, I'm blanking. It's called Down and Dirty Pictures. So yeah, those are 3 authors I just think are, they write about movies and Hollywood history in this way that makes you feel like you're at a sports game almost. Like it's exciting. It's personalities, big personalities, epic changes in culture, and it all feels exciting and present. And that's sort of really what I wanted to do, is to make the reader feel like they were in the Oscar race of 1942, and you almost don't know what's going to happen next. In the same way that every year we are immersed in every twist and turn of the Oscar race as it's happening. I kind of wanted you to feel that way about these old races.
And I felt that way. So I think you absolutely succeeded in your book. And I love that it's Oscar Wars. I think that was a great, just a great title. So before we end, is there one movie? Are you movied out, or are you still going to films?
Oh my gosh. I had such a great time just watching movies writing this book. I mean, it was over the course of 4 years. But I rewatched a lot of movies. I saw a lot of movies for the first time I had not seen before. And now I'm covering the Oscar race this year for The New Yorker. So I've been trying to see every single thing that's nominated this year. So I guess, no, I'm not movied out. It was a great time. And I love hearing that you read the book and kept going to YouTube. I hope people read it and take a break and watch one of the movies. You read about Betty Davis's big snub in 1935 Of Human Bondage, and you can go watch it.
Right, absolutely. Michael, thank you so much for taking time from your Oscar writing this year to be on the show with us. It was great talking to you, and thank you for the book. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you for having me, Nancy. It was great talking with you.
Thank you.